They didn't raise their voices when they took the company away from me. Nobody slammed a door. There was just this long, polished table in a conference room on the 17th floor in Midtown Manhattan, 3 blocks from Bryant Park, and a folder pushed gently in my direction. I can still see the reflection of the overhead lights on the table more clearly than I remember a single person's face. They told me to look at page 3. On paper, as of that moment, I no longer existed in the company I'd started in a cramped apartment in Queens. I remember sitting there thinking very calmly, so this is what it feels like when your life changes and nobody hears anything. What makes it strange is that nothing seemed wrong that morning. I woke up at 5:15 a.m. in our apartment in Astoria out of habit before my alarm. My wife was still half asleep, one arm across the pillow where my laptop usually ended up. I made coffee in the small kitchen with the cheap drip machine that left a faint burnt smell if you didn't wash it out properly. I sat at the little table by the window, opened my MacBook, and checked our dashboard like I did every morning. Back then, this was around 2019. The numbers looked fine. Not spectacular, but fine. Revenue was trending up, churn was stable, and we'd closed 2 decent-sized clients the previous quarter. My calendar for that day just said, Board meeting strategy review 10:00 a.m. for us. That usually meant 3 hours of slides, a few compliments, and at least one person hinting we should be growing faster. If you told me that by late afternoon I'd be walking out with a cardboard box, I would have thought you had the wrong guy. I started the company 11 years earlier in 2008 when I was 38. That's late in startup years. I was living in a 1-bedroom in Jackson Heights back then, with a wobbly IKEA desk wedged between the bed and the window. I had about $47,000 saved, mostly in an old brokerage account I'd been too scared to touch for years. I remember logging in, staring at the balance and thinking, if I use this and it goes to 0, then what? That feeling never really leaves you, by the way. I printed out a bank statement, and on the back of that, I sketched the first version of what the product could be. Not on a whiteboard, not in some fancy brainstorming session, just on the back of a statement with a sticky note covering the part that said available balance. From the beginning, my idea was simple. I wanted to help small service businesses actually understand their numbers. Not the glossy version their accountants summarized once a year, but the messy, day-to-day truth. I used to say in early meetings, we're not here to sell you a miracle. We're here to show you what's really going on, even if it's uncomfortable. In 2009 and 2010, I'd ride the subway with my old laptop in a backpack, going from a dentist in Brooklyn to a logistics company in Long Island City to some tiny agency in the Flatiron area. Half the time, people nodded politely and didn't call back. The other half, a few of them pulled out a checkbook. Those few were enough to keep the lights on. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York near Binghamton. My dad worked in a hardware store. My mom did part-time bookkeeping for local shops. I remember being 8 or 9, sitting at the dining table while she reconciled receipts. Every so often, she'd shake her head and say, "They have no idea how close they are to running out of cash." That stuck with me. So when I built the software, I wanted it to be the thing my mom could have used to warn people earlier instead of too late. The first sign that something was off in the company didn't feel like a red flag. It looked like progress. 3 years in, sometime around 2011, we were profitable, barely, but I was paying myself less than the junior engineer I'd hired. My wife would occasionally ask, "So when does this become normal?" I didn't have a good answer. Then one spring, an investor from a well-known fund in San Francisco flew into New York and invited me to dinner at a restaurant near Union Square. It was one of those places where the waiter refills your water so quietly you don't notice. He told me he liked my conservative temperament, said it was refreshing that we were profitable, and then casually mentioned that with the right capital, we could own this segment in 5 years. I remember watching him swirl his wine while he said it like he was evaluating an asset, not a life. At first I thought, this is what we've been waiting for, validation. I told myself I was being rational, not greedy. We negotiated the usual things, valuation, board seats, a vesting refresh for me. I pushed to keep more than half the company. We landed at 44% for me, the rest spread between early employees and the new investors. Walking home that night, I repeated a sentence in my head. Control isn't just about the percentage, it's about trust. It sounded wise at the time. Looking back, it was wishful thinking dressed up as insight. A couple of years later, the compliments started to change shape. At board meetings, they began referring to me as the visionary and to the new CEO as the operator. We hadn't had a CEO before. I'd been filling that role badly some days, but honestly, hiring him was their idea. On paper, it made sense. He had scale experience, a resume full of big names, and a crisp way of speaking that I never had. The division sounded practical. I'd focus on product and long-term direction. He'd run execution. It felt grown up. It also quietly moved me one step away from actual levers of control. I still remember the first board deck I didn't build. For years, I'd been the one putting everything together: revenue, burn, customer concentration, risks. I'd obsess over little notes like, "We rely too heavily on 3 clients for 40% of MRR." One quarter, I got a PDF of the deck from the CEO about 10 minutes before the meeting with a short message. "Streamline things, you'll like it." I opened it. The revenue charts were big and clean, all upward lines. The risk section, the part I usually wrote in full sentences, was now 3 bullet points tucked into the appendix. "We'll talk through those verbally," he said later, smiling at me from the far end of the table. It didn't set off sirens in my head at that moment. I just had a small, nagging thought. Why hide the part that actually keeps us alive? But I let it pass. I told myself I was being paranoid. There were other small changes. I stopped being CC'd on some of the emails with our biggest customer. When I asked, the CEO told me, "I'm trying to protect your time from day-to-day noise. You need to be thinking bigger." Our new VP of Finance, someone we hired from a larger SaaS company, moved our reporting into a more formal system. My direct access to raw data started going through her. "We're maturing the finance function," she said. It sounded professional. But when I asked her for the old, detailed reports, she hesitated for just half a second before saying, "Of course." That half second stuck with me much more than the words did. These are the tiny things you ignore because you want to be reasonable. You don't want to be the difficult founder. You tell yourself, they know what they're doing. This is how grown-up companies run. The real shift started about 5 years after that initial big investment, sometime around 2016. We had launched an adjacent product to hit the kind of high growth our new investors loved. I had argued quietly against it at first. Our original product was honest and a bit boring. Gave owners real insight, but only if they were willing to sit with some uncomfortable truths. The new product was flashier. It promised predictive insights and benchmarking, and it sold quickly when bundled with discounts. The early numbers looked great on slides, but the customers we were attracting were different. They cared more about promotions than about actually using the product. They churned more. They complained more. One night, I stayed late at the office, long after most people had left. We were in a shared floor near Herald Square by then, concrete floors, white walls, the standard startup look. It was maybe 9:30 p.m. The cleaning crew's vacuum was humming in the hallway. I opened up the raw data exports myself. I stripped out the one-time fees and aggressive discounts from the revenue line. I looked at what each new dollar of revenue was costing us in sales, commissions, support, and infrastructure. When I graphed it, the line that mattered most, the one mapping marginal revenue against marginal cost, was going the wrong direction. At first, I thought I'd made a mistake in the spreadsheet. I redid it twice. Same result. The more of the new product we sold, the worse the economics got. That's the opposite of what you want. I printed the graph and pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. For a few nights, I'd just sit there staring at it, wondering if I was overreacting. Eventually, I did what I always did when something bothered me. I wrote a memo. 4 pages, single-spaced, laying out exactly what I saw. I explained how the blended gross margin was being masked by early contract structures, how customer acquisition cost was trending up even as lifetime value got shakier. I ended with a sentence that, even as I typed it, I thought sounded a little dramatic. If we continue on this path for another 12-18 months without adjustment, we will likely hit a point where a single bad quarter could threaten our solvency. I printed copies, stuck them in a plain manila folder, and took them to the next board meeting. This one was in our own office, small glass-walled conference room, fake plant in the corner, stale coffee in the pot. The CEO went first with his slides. Big numbers, glowing logos, slide titles like market dominance and category leadership. When he paused to breathe, I said, "Can we look at something before we move on?" and handed out my memo. The room went quiet in that specific way I've only experienced in boardrooms. Nobody speaks, but you can hear chair fabric shifting and people flipping pages. One investor, the one who'd flown out from San Francisco years before, looked up and said, "This feels very conservative." He didn't say wrong, just conservative in that tone that means you're being overly cautious. Another board member nodded and said something like, "The market rewards growth. Profitability is something we can optimize later." The CEO smiled at me as if we were on the same side of an inside joke and said, "We're all aligned on where we're going. We're just debating the speed." Sitting there, I had this sudden, sharp thought. I might be the only one here afraid of the downside. I wish I could tell you I slammed my hand on the table or threatened to resign on the spot. What actually happened is much more ordinary. I pushed back for maybe 20 minutes, repeating myself in slightly different words. I could feel the air getting heavier. People started glancing at the clock. At some point, I heard myself say, "Okay, fine, let's revisit this next quarter," even though nothing inside me felt okay. I walked out of that room with my memo folded in half in my briefcase, feeling like I'd just apologized for telling the truth. Over the next year, exactly what I'd modeled started to show up in the numbers. Revenue continued to climb, so did our losses. To cover it, we raised another round at a higher valuation from later-stage investors who liked the story. High growth on the path to profitability. Internally, the narrative was very polished. We were investing in growth, capturing market share, extending our lead. Externally, it worked. We got written up in a couple of business blogs. I was invited to speak at a conference in Las Vegas about disciplined scaling. I remember pacing backstage with a little mic taped to my cheek, thinking, if they knew how nervous our cash flow projections make me, they wouldn't use the word disciplined. Sometime around then, I started to feel a kind of low-level anxiety that never completely went away. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. in our new apartment in Long Island City. We'd finally upgraded, stare at the ceiling, and start mentally running through worst-case scenarios. At first I thought, maybe this is just what growth feels like. But then those scenarios stopped sounding hypothetical. They started sounding like a slightly accelerated version of reality. I tried sounding out my co-founder, a guy who had joined me in the early days when it was just the two of us in that overheated coworking space in Chelsea, sharing a second-hand fan. One evening we were sitting in a noisy bar near Penn Station after work, nursing beers we were too tired to finish. I mentioned my concerns. He listened, then shrugged and said, "Look, these guys have done this before. They know how to push. We've always been the ones dragging our feet. Maybe this is the stretch we need." I didn't have a good comeback. There was a part of me that wondered if I was just getting older and more risk-averse. The thing that really punched a hole in my illusion of control was a job posting. A friend texted me a screenshot one afternoon with a question mark. It was from our own company website, Chief Strategy Officer, New York. I read the description twice. It was basically my job portioned out into bullet points, defining roadmap, aligning product with market, long-term planning. I remember staring at my phone in the middle of the open office and feeling slightly disoriented, like maybe I'd missed an internal email. I walked straight into the CEO's office. His glass door was half open. I held up my phone and said, "What's this?" He didn't flinch. "We need more senior leadership," he said. "You'll still be founder and executive chair. This person will execute your vision." The way he said it made it sound like I'd be some kind of wise elder statesman. Executive chair looks good on LinkedIn, but I knew what it meant operationally, less direct say in the day-to-day. I told him I'd be okay with it only if we wrote down certain rights, like veto power on major strategic shifts and C-level hires. He said, "Of course we'll have legal draft something, don't worry." We shook hands. The documents never materialized. Every time I followed up with the company's lawyer, I got some version of, "We're still working on the language." In the meantime, the new chief strategy officer joined us. He was bright, charismatic, confident. In his first week, he had a whiteboard session where he said, "Legacy thinking is our biggest constraint." I remember that phrase because I felt oddly uneasy hearing it. At first I thought, he means old processes. Later, I realized we were the legacy. Looking back, there were so many small things I should have taken more seriously. One day, I noticed I wasn't on the invite list for a product roadmap offsite. When I asked about it, the chief strategy officer said, "We just wanted this one to be more tactical. We'll loop you in on the outputs." Another time, our biggest client flew in for a partnership summit, and I only found out because I saw them in the office kitchen getting coffee. When I asked why I wasn't in the meetings, the CEO said, "You've been stretched thin. We didn't want to overload you." Every single incident had a smooth explanation. But over time, it felt like the building was slowly being rearranged while I was still inside, and somehow my office kept ending up farther from where the decisions were made. The real gut punch came from something I technically wasn't supposed to see. One afternoon, I received an email thread by mistake. It had a document attached called Founder Transition Plan. My name was in the title. At first I thought, this must be something I agreed to and forgot about. Then I opened it. It was a tidy 3-page plan about evolving the founder role into a more external ambassadorial position. It had bullet points about how to communicate the change to staff, how to frame it to the press, suggested quotes about new chapters and focus on family. On page 3 there was a timeline. It named a target date for my resignation announcement, roughly 3 months away. Seeing your own exit scheduled like a dental appointment is a strange feeling. I remember just staring at the screen for a while. My first instinct was to assume there'd been some mistake, that this was an exploration document. Then another thought crept in. No, this is the plan, you're just late to reading it. I closed my laptop, walked around the block twice, then went to the CEO's office. I told him I saw the transition plan. He sighed in that way people do when they wish the timing were different and said, "We were going to talk with you next week. This is about positioning the company for the next phase. Investors are worried we seem too founder-centric." I asked him straight, "So what happens if I say I don't want to step down?" He said, "No one wants this to be adversarial. We're all on the same side." I left his office knowing two things. One, I wasn't on the same side anymore, and two, they'd already moved to the next step mentally. I told him I wouldn't resign voluntarily. I reminded him I still had board and some shareholder rights, even if I didn't have majority equity. I said removing me would be messy and visible. He gave me a tight smile and repeated that line about not wanting a fight. Around that time, one of our earlier, smaller investors called me. He'd always been more straightforward. We met at a noisy cafe near Grand Central. After some small talk, he leaned in and said, "Look, you should know this. Some of the later stage guys have been discussing strategic options if the numbers go sideways." I asked what he meant. He hesitated, then said, "There's a scenario where if the debt gets too heavy and we breach covenants, they could basically buy the assets out of a restructuring and wipe the current cap table. Legally." He said legally like that made it less brutal. I remember my coffee getting cold while he talked. At first, I thought he was exaggerating. Then, as he laid out the mechanics, it clicked. They weren't just ignoring the risk of bankruptcy. They were quietly setting up a situation where a $5 million bankruptcy might actually be a tool, not a disaster, for them. The company, as an entity, could fail. The business, stripped of its debt and old shareholders, could be reborn under a new corporate shell. That realization changed how I viewed everything. I had been assuming everyone at the table shared the same primary objective: keep the company healthy and alive. It finally hit me that some people's real objective was to maximize their own payoff. And if that meant the old company died on paper, so be it. They could walk away and re-enter through a different door. The actual removal happened in that board meeting I mentioned at the beginning, the one with the folder. It was on a cloudy Wednesday morning. I remember there'd been some light rain earlier because the window behind the head of the table had streaks on it. Our outside counsel was there in the corner, which was unusual. The printed agenda in front of each seat had one bold line: leadership and governance discussion. The CEO started by talking about clarity and alignment. He said something like, "At this stage, the company needs a single clear voice on strategy and operations." Then one of the newer board members, someone from the last funding round, spoke up. He said in a very calm tone, "We've had a number of conversations, and the consensus is that the company would be better served if you stepped down from all executive roles and from the board effective immediately." He added, "We value what you've done as founder. We'd like to offer you a consulting agreement and accelerate the rest of your vesting." It was surreal. Nobody said, "You messed up." Nobody yelled. It sounded almost polite. While they talked, I had these small, disconnected memories popping up. The day I opened our first business bank account at a branch in Queens with a name the teller mispronounced 3 times. The time my first engineer and I ate $1 pizza at 2 a.m. because we didn't want to spend money on delivery while we were debugging a reporting bug. My wife texting me pictures of our kids' school events I'd missed because I was on calls with clients. I asked just one question out loud. "And if I say no?" The lawyer answered. He explained that according to the governance documents we'd signed in the last funding round, the board had the power to remove me as an officer by majority vote. They could also recommend my removal from the board itself, and with their combined ownership, that vote would likely pass among shareholders. I knew all of this in theory. I had signed those documents after all, but it hits differently when someone reads the consequences back to you. So then I asked, "And what about the debt situation? What about the risk of default if we keep burning like this?" One of the investors said, "We're aware of the risks. We have contingency plans." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. 3 days later, after talking with my wife and losing a lot of sleep, I signed. People sometimes judge that. They say I would have fought. Maybe they would have. In my case, I had to weigh the real options. Dragging it into a legal battle wouldn't magically fix the balance sheet. It would just drain money and time and probably still end with a similar outcome, only uglier. At some point, I realized I was fighting not for the company's survival, but for my own pride. Once I admitted that, the calculus shifted. The day I left, I packed my things into a plain brown box. There wasn't much. A notebook with scribbles from the early days, a couple of business books with dog-eared pages, a photo from our first team offsite upstate. Everyone standing in front of a rental cabin, holding coffee cups and pretending we weren't freezing. My mug with the little crack in the handle that no one else wanted. I said goodbye to a few people quietly at their desks. Some of them looked genuinely sad, Others looked confused, like they weren't sure what they were supposed to say. I didn't stop by every desk. I didn't make a speech. I just walked to the elevator and pressed the button, and when the doors closed, I remember thinking, that's it. That's how it ends, not with some big moment, just with this. The internal email went out a couple of hours later. Someone forwarded it to me. It said I was transitioning into an advisory role and that this had been in the works for some time. It talked about exciting new chapters and doubling down on growth. Reading it, if you didn't know the backstory, you would have thought this was my idea. The company filed for bankruptcy about 11 months after I left. I didn't get a call. I found out the way everyone else did, through a public notice. It was a Chapter 11 filing listing around $5 million more in liabilities than assets. By then, this was early 2021. The pandemic had hit, which didn't help. Some of our clients, especially in hospitality and retail, were struggling or shutting down. Renewals became harder. A minor product outage at a bad time cost us a couple of big accounts. All the little cracks we'd papered over got wider. I read through the filing more carefully than most people, I'm sure. Vendors were listed with unpaid invoices. There were notes about a planned sale of certain assets to another entity. A few months later, I saw a press release from a new company. Different name, similar product, some familiar phrases in their marketing. With a little digging, it became clear that a subset of our former investors now controlled this new entity. The code base, customer list, and some key staff had essentially moved over. On paper, they had bought assets out of a failed company. In practice, they just shed the debt and old shareholders. A friend asked me over coffee, "Aren't you furious?" I had to think about that. There was anger, but not in the way people imagine. It wasn't a hot, explosive anger. It was more like a cold, deep disappointment, mostly in myself. I had agreed to every step. I had signed the documents. I had told myself at each fork, this is fine. This is normal. Around the time of the bankruptcy, I wrote one line in my journal that I still think about. If you give someone else the steering wheel, you lose the right to be surprised by where you end up. That sounds harsher than I feel it, but it's true. There are a few things I wish I'd understood much earlier. One is that ownership isn't just about how many shares you hold. It's about how aligned the decision makers are with the people who bear the actual consequences. Once those two things drift apart, everything gets fragile. If the people making the big calls can walk away with reputations intact and maybe even a good return, while you're the one left explaining to vendors and employees what happened, something is off. That's not a moral judgment, it's just a structural reality. Another is that most of what feels like betrayal in business isn't someone waking up and deciding, I'm going to betray this person today. It's systems and incentives pushing people in certain directions. The investors weren't cartoon villains. The CEO wasn't some evil mastermind. They were responding to pressures I invited in the moment I said yes to their money and their terms. I'm not absolving anyone. I'm saying the real story is more boring and in some ways more unsettling than a simple good guys versus bad guys narrative. And I had to admit something unflattering to myself. The traits that helped in the early years, my caution, my obsession with downside, my tendency to double-check assumptions, became liabilities in a later stage environment obsessed with speed. I thought those same traits would be valued when the stakes got higher. Instead, they were treated as resistance. I was out of sync with the game being played, and I didn't adjust or opt out early enough. These days, when I talk to younger founders, sometimes over coffee in little places around the city, I don't tell them, never take outside money or always keep control. That's too simplistic. I just ask them a few questions. One of them is, if this all blows up, who carries it? If the honest answer is me, then I tell them they have to be absolutely stubborn about the kind of control and veto power they retain. Not symbolic titles, real say. If they can't get that, then they need to decide if the trade is still worth it. I also ask them, what's the thing you're afraid to say out loud about your numbers or your strategy because everyone else is so excited? Those unsaid things matter. If every time you bring up something uncomfortable, people change the subject or label you negative, that's a sign. Optimism is nice. Arithmetic doesn't care. Sometimes people want a neat quote at the end of this story, something they can put in a slide deck. I don't really have one that fixes anything. The closest I can get is this: be careful when someone offers you a lot of speed as long as you stop asking certain questions. That's the trade I didn't fully see when I made it. Now, a few years later, my life looks different. I do some quiet consulting. I spend more evenings at home in Queens than I used to. Occasionally, I'll meet a founder who looks the way I used to look, tired, hopeful, overstretched, and they'll ask, what's the one thing you'd do differently? I usually tell them, I'd be much more honest with myself about what I'm giving up the moment I let someone else decide how much risk I should take on. The strangest part is that, on paper, my story fits neatly into a couple of lines. Founder pushed out, company bankrupt, assets sold. It looks almost clean when you compress it. But when I think about it, I don't see bullet points. I see little moments. That first bank statement turned into a sketch, the memo nobody wanted to read, the graph on the corkboard, my wife asking if we were going to be okay, that feeling of the elevator doors closing as I left for the last time. Losing the company didn't end my life. It ended a version of me that believed other people would protect my sense of responsibility as fiercely as I did. What came after has been quieter. I make decisions slower now, but with a different kind of clarity. If there's one rule I try to live by these days, it's this. Never let someone else have the final say over something you'll be the one lying awake at night worrying about.